There's a very early record with John Adams on one side and Brian Eno on the other. That's a very cool record. Obscure Records, I think #1 and #2, which was a very cool record in the late 70s. And I heard John's music, and I had heard about the music John was making in San Francisco, the kind of new and unusual music series he was doing with the San Francisco Symphony. Word of that trickled back here to the East Coast. And when I graduated from college, I worked those summers at the Monadnock Music Festival in New Hampshire. And who was visiting in New Hampshire? But of course, John Adams came to one of those concerts, and I met him there. And I said, let's do an opera called Nixon in China. And he said, I don't think so. And that was that. And then a year later, he called and said, are you serious? I said, yes. He said, okay. And then we started. What was thrilling with John's early music, and particularly a piece like Shaker Loops, which is, it's very dramatic. John, there's a lot of amazing music being written in the kind of 70s and 80s avant-garde. But John was one of the very few composers who was building dramatic shapes and was using harmony in a way that there was this tremendous tension and then incredible release. And so he was just a great dramatic composer. And you could really shape a big picture drama. At the same time, John had this wild sense of humor. And so the music had all these amazing tonal shifts. So like Mozart, you were constantly going through all these levels of irony, all these levels of fantastic emotional color and nuance that wasn't just big movie music, that was just overwhelming your emotions, and now let's all cry, and now let's all applaud, and now let's all have a standing ovation, which is kind of annoying and feels like bad politicians, and yet we see it all the time in opera. It's like a bad understanding of the possibilities of opera and the kind of Hollywoodization of the whole audience is going to feel one thing, starting now, go. And for me, the joy of opera is like Mozart. There are all these flickering emotions moving across the whole landscape. And you want to laugh out loud and then suddenly go, oh no, that's horrible. And then just in the middle of it being horrible, it's ridiculous. And then in the middle of it being ridiculous, it's sad. And then in the middle of all these things are going on simultaneously. And John has this incredible musical gift where the temperature shifts bar by bar, moment to moment, this kind of sudden, just hovering sense of emotion that is always arriving in some new and very, very subtle way. And the operas never just bash you over the head with some big, obvious emotion. They always treat you as intelligent. They always realize that all of us, particularly in our generation, have a lot of complicated reactions to things. And we're not just going to join up and march in step, but we need music that breathes a little more and gives us all a little more space to imagine what we imagine, feel what we feel, and reflect and enter a larger landscape, a bigger picture. And John's music is always opening you into some bigger, more incredible landscape. So I knew from Shaker Loops that, John had this kind of scope. What was beautiful with Nixon in China was to see how raunchy, these fantastic raunchy textures. And at the same time, the kind of Jerry Lee Lewis does Mao Zedong, which was fantastic. And those kind of meetings. And at the same time, the kind of visionary part of minimalism, which was in those early days, that sense that minimalism was about creating vast inner spaces or vastness. That vastness was a subject, and China was a useful subject that was just vast. And John's music takes you into this vastness. And then this gift that John had for Nixon and Pat, who are the most poignant, saddest, strangest people. And horrifying, and at the same time you can't not be moved by them and to respond to their horrifying, flawed humanity, which is so real. And John was able to create music that lets you get close to these people that you thought you'd never be close to. And Mao Zedong and Chang Ching, these crazy icons, became living, breathing, deeply human people. And their weirdness and their closeness and their, again, horrifying humanity made you not just able to hate them. And John's music does what music does, is it reaches across all your own personal borders and takes you into this place where there's a deeper flow that's moving through all of our lives and that is connecting us in all these unexpected and surprising ways. And John touched China without ever sounding Chinese. But what makes the journey is John's musical language, which again reaches across all these borders and moves into this amazing shared place. And that's what a great composer does. Well, John's energy is very, like his music, heightened and blazing at every minute. Every minute, all those nerves are moving, and that kind of da-da-da-da-da-da-da that's underneath all of John's music, that is going underneath John. And John is hypersensitive, super awake, all these ideas and thoughts. He reads deeply, he reads voraciously. And so he's in the middle of some intense 400-page biography of somebody, and he's caught up on all the latest political blogs and knows exactly what's going on in some really obscure political dogfight. He is so on it. And that kind of awareness and that informed quality that he has, and he's always engaged. Good days and bad days, he composes. There is not a day he's not just working. And his discipline is unbelievable. And he just goes in there and he comes out with a masterpiece on his worst day. It's a horrible day, and he just goes in there and reemerges with a masterpiece. And his self-doubt is genuine. His yearning, you feel it in the music. And what makes the music profound, like Beethoven, is the self-doubt. Is not that it's this confident triumphalism, but that you watch him question himself so deeply. And at the same time, the beauty, the sheer physical beauty of the orchestration, of the way he hears instruments, of the way he creates combinations, of the way the harmonies really just get richer and darker and psychologically more charged and go into a place of a kind of darkly resonating moral soul. And so the music has this kind of soul power, this inner light that comes from a dark place. And that John is willing to reach in there. And that his music doesn't come from this easy or available place, but really digs and digs and digs and digs and digs and digs. And at the same time, he's not an enemy of pleasure. And, and I think, together with Alice Waters in Berkeley, I think, John has figured out the world will be saved by pleasure. Not by pointing a finger and saying to someone, you are horrible. But the opposite is that can we create a space of pleasure? And as soon as you create this space of pleasure, we can share the planet. And pleasure is going to be the thing that actually unwinds people from their own most toxic selves and creates this joy factor that is actually necessary for life and to sustain life. And there must be joy. John Adams' music is filled with joy, is filled with this kind of joyous, beautiful, blazing life force that is not apologizing for how committed to life it is. And this deep commitment to the most joyous level of expression at a time when the whole world is this cynical, is this bitter. There's this much bad news every day. And John chooses joy not as an escape, but as an answer. Like John is not stepping away from the conversation. John is actually entering the conversation and proposing this as the response. And so these operas are very powerful because you feel his engagement as a person in the world, and that he cares about this world, and he really wants to engage it. And he wants to engage it with this deep idealism that connects, this New England streak he's got that is Thoreau and Charles Ives, this kind of highest level of New England idealism, that we need to raise the level here. We're going to elevate this conversation, that America is about this, lift this up. Let us actually go with our ideals here, because our ideals are amazing. And in the light of our ideals, these crises begin to appear not just as a kind of dead-end problem, but you realize you've been given something in your life to solve, and this is the work of our generation. And so each of John's operas turns out to be what the work of our generation is. Ecologically, the nuclear stuff, the East and West, response to terrorism. Every one of John's pieces is addressing the agenda of our generation on this earth, what we're doing during our lifetimes on this planet. John is writing the soundtrack for our activism, for our engagement, for our spiritual renewal, for refreshing our exhausted selves and going back in there on a battle that we should not concede. We should not lose. Actually, we need to stay in there. And this is music that stays in there. When you look at a great painter, and you see the early work, and you see the middle work, and you see the later work, you watch it get richer. You watch it go through lots of phases. But the later work, you see the entire body of work in every piece. You see the range where he can just, at his fingertips, access this or that language, access this or that color, access, there's no limit. And I think the most beautiful thing about John's later works, like Flowering Tree, is that the entire palette is present of a lifetime of composing. And so the mastery is technical, is, the virtuosity is complete. But what's perhaps the most astounding is the inspiration, which is just flowing at such a high level now, and where it's just the bar by bar, moment to moment level of ideas are incredible. And you're now at a place where there are no more labels. You can't say this is minimalism, this is, there's no way to label the music John is writing now. It is like labeling a late Gauguin canvas. You don't just call it post-impressionism. I mean, no. I think it's a lot more than that. And that's what's so exciting, is that the music has transcended the labels so completely. And it is John's own utterly personal, super rich form of expression and reflection. And so he's able to articulate things with such kind of exactitude and at the same time flair. And the music for Flowering Tree is so joyous, exhilarating. You know, and Dr. Atomic was a long haul and a really dark nightmare corridor to get lost in. And the idea that you could open a door and you're in the garden of Flowering Tree, that's just incredible. And I don't know many composers whose just body of work has that kind of range. And where, you know, now that John is, you know, past 60, there's no limit as to what he can do. And nobody to compare him to. There's no school of, or, you know, he's just making his own body of work. And now that we can see the arc of it, you love Nixon in China because it's such a great first opera as just on a real high of inspiration and ambition and craziness and fearlessness. Flowering Tree, all those qualities are still there, but it has such a deep, deep, deep sense of fulfillment, not just promise. And you say, oh, we're in the presence of one of the greats. Well, I think most of the history of music and drama are people who love working together. So, you know, Verdi found a few people and he kept working for them. Mozart found a few people and kept working with them. John Adams has found a few people and he's kept working with them. And that's pretty cool because, again, a language gets evolved and people are able to create something that begins to have its own really clear stamp, its own identity that lets every piece be utterly different and at the same time totally recognizable as a body of work of this group of artists. And I think one of the things that John's music, and that puts him in a very special category in opera, is his music is insanely difficult to perform. And so what he's demanding is maximum intelligence and virtuosity from his performers. You know, the interpreters, what they're up against is so crazy, it is so intellectually challenging, it is so technically horrific, and you have to be so smart and fearless and then emotionally available. I mean, it calls for a superhuman level of performers who are also human. And so John has evolved his own performers who have really grown up with his music. And the pieces have evolved as the performers have evolved, which is really beautiful. But they're really high levels of demands, which is why some of the pieces are not just taken up by every opera company, because they're really hard. It is not, let's do Bohème on 2 rehearsals. No. This is scary stuff. It's intricate, it's demanding. You need an orchestra and a chorus that can cut it. And it needs to be rehearsed. This is not heat and serve. This is work and work and work and sweat bullets. And because John Adams' music is tonal, if something's off, you hear it. There's a lot of contemporary music that is very badly performed, but who would know? Whereas with John's music, if there's one wrong note, everyone says, what was that? You know, and it's very glaring. So you have to really, really master this incredibly demanding music. But of course, that's what also makes these operas have such moral high ground, is because the performers themselves are stepping up to such a high level of what life is asking from us and holding our own standards for ourselves so high that the rest of the world has to say, okay, all right, I can respect that. And the performances themselves demand respect.